Hi there, my name's Richard Foster, and I'm going to be reading you an extract from my book, Premier League Nuggets. And as you can see behind me, I've written a few books, so this is my sixth and most recent book. And we're going to start off with a foreword by Martin Tyler. Attention to detail was one of the first lessons I was taught when I started out in television many moons ago. Richard Foster has a rare gift in that respect, and Premier League Nuggets is another example of his ability to share those details in an engrossing and entertaining way. The book is all-encompassing, but also full of the titbits of trivia that we football fans absolutely adore. It is a great way to test out the memory of your mates. That the number of clubs which have appeared in the Premier League is 49 is a typical statistic which draws you in. Which team will round it up and give the author a perfect excuse for a reprint? I've been very fortunate to commentate on Premier League matches for Sky Sports since the league's inception in 1992. I've always maintained that English football is the most watchable in the world, and the universal viewing figures support that belief. As a broadcaster, every game is an adventure. My mantra is always to look forward. There is not too much time to look back. But Premier League Nuggets is an extremely handy, very entertaining, and totally reliable reference point to have by my side. So that's Martin Tyler's words, and now from the introduction to the book. Going to Selhurst Park for the opening day of the Premier League season did not feel too different to the hundreds of games that I'd already attended since my first foray into live football back in 1969. The fact that it was a top flight game was a bonus, as for most of the intervening 23 years, Palace had been loitering without too much intent in the second division for 11 pretty inglorious seasons, with a brief dip into the third division for a dose of harsh reality. And that was interspersed by 9 seasons in the first division to give an all too brief glimpse of life among the sunnier uplands. Much of the football was pretty poor, and traipsing up and down the country following the likes of Trevor Aylott and John Lacey was possibly good for the soul, but did not do too much for one's self-respect. The beautiful game seemed an alien and distant concept throughout most of this period. So, on Saturday the 15th of August 1992, it was Blackburn at home, a team that Palace had beaten a few years before in a dramatic playoff final to secure the club's latest tilt at trying to establish themselves in the upper echelons of league football. Things had gone pretty well since, with a first ever FA Cup final appearance in 1990, followed by the club's highest ever position of third in 1991, behind Liverpool and the champions Arsenal. There was a solid, respectable 10th position in 1992, the last season before the advent of the Premier League. Blackburn themselves had just been promoted via the playoffs, so were back in the big time for the first time since England had lifted the World Cup. And so both clubs were part of the whole new ball game, which was how the original Premier League announced itself in August 1992 to an unsuspecting audience. As ever with the opening day of any season, the tingling mixture of optimism and anticipation, accompanied by a warm sunny day, had the juices flowing for what lay ahead. The match did not disappoint, as it was a cracking encounter, with the fortunes swaying to and fro before the satisfaction of Simon Osborne's 90th minute equaliser nullified the disappointment of losing an early lead. The quality of the goals added to the excitement of the 3-3 draw, with the second Palace goal a particular highlight, as the ball was expertly lobbed into the net from the edge of the penalty area. It was a combination of fine judgment, excellent vision and was beautifully executed. The man responsible was destined to go far in the sport, and indeed it was appropriate that Gareth Southgate, the future England manager, should score on the opening day of the Premier League. But that accomplished strike was overshadowed by two equally good goals for the visitors from their new centre-forward, who just arrived from Southampton for £3.5 million, a transfer record at the time. Step forward Alan Shearer. His first Rovers goal was similar to Southgate's, as he brought the ball down with his chest before nonchalantly lobbing Nigel Martyn from the edge of the box. His second was even better, as he picked the ball up near the left touchline, forged inside before unleashing a measured effort inside the far post. Little did we know then that those two fine goals were the precursor to another 258 that the Premier League's record goalscorer would accumulate over the next 14 seasons. But we had seen an early glimpse of his undoubted prowess. There's a whole gamut of facts and figures in this book for every club that has graced, or sometimes disgraced, the Premier League, with dismal defeats rubbing shoulders with valiant victories, and invincibles cheek by jowl with incompetence. Each of the 49 clubs that have taken their bow in the Premier League are featured. I do feel just a tad conflicted in writing this book, as I and many others have often railed against those who consider that 1992 represents year zero. The glossing over of more than 100 years of league football that preceded the advent of the Premier League borders on the sacrilegious. The following quote sums up the attitude of those who could be termed as contrarians. Nearly everything possible had been done to spoil the game. The heavy financial interest, the absurd transfer and player selling system, the absurd publicity given to every feature of the press, and the monstrous partisanships of the crowds. This could have been uttered by any of those who find the most recent changes in the way the game is run both distasteful and destructive of the very spirit of the game. But in fact, this expression of disdain was from that curmudgeonly Yorkshireman J.B. Priestley back in 1933. Plus ça change. Priestley died in August 1984, but his words are still very much alive and kicking today. The Premier League is often portrayed as the great pariah of the game, and while the technical quality may not match some of the other European leagues, there's no denying its global popularity. Some will scoff at this and criticise the relentless pursuit of money and rapaciousness, but as somebody who witnessed much of what went on in the previous 2 decades, I've enjoyed both periods for different reasons. Charles Dickens's words at the start of A Tale of Two Cities are strangely appropriate when describing the birth of the Premier League. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the autumn of despair. Many supporters will recognise seasons of darkness and the odd autumn of despair, while the lucky few will have experienced some seasons of light and the odd spring of hope. The full range is encapsulated here in the book. Despite this growing inequality, and indeed partly inspired by it, I was keen to show that every single one of the 49 clubs have made their own mark, irrespective of their size, their stature, and the length of their tenure. Even though they only lasted 1 season, for example, Blackpool and Barnsley had their moments and, for the most part, enjoyed their season in the sun. and have as much right to be featured as the behemoths of both the two Manchester clubs and those London clubs, Chelsea and Arsenal, who between them have gobbled up 25 of the 27 titles available. And I hope I've struck the right balance in the coverage of each club. The Premier League has given us some magical moments and some startling statistics over the last quarter of a century or so, and plenty of them are collected here. Naturally, I will have missed a fair few, as the odd one will have slipped through the net. But I'd be delighted to hear from anybody who has some of their own Premier League nuggets that are not featured here, but you feel are worthy of inclusion. They might well end up in either the sequel to this book, or at the very least, provoke some debate or discussion in the future via the maelstrom that is social media. Finally, I finished writing this book in June 2019. So the line has been drawn at the end of the 2018-19 season for any records, facts or statistics, some of which will undoubtedly be broken in the forthcoming seasons. Thanks and happy reading.